Colonial Brazil, Portuguese, Brazil colonial, sometimes referred to as Portuguese America, comprises the period from 1500, with the arrival of the Portuguese, until 1815, when Brazil was elevated to a kingdom in union with Portugal. During the 300 years of Brazilian colonial history, the main economic activities of the territory were based first on Brazil wood extraction, Brazil wood cycle, which gave the territory its name, sugar production, sugar cycle, and finally on gold and diamond mining, gold cycle. Slaves, especially those brought from Africa, provided most of the workforce of the Brazilian export economy, after a brief initial period of indigenous slavery to cut Brazilwood. In contrast to the neighboring Spanish possessions, which had several viceroyalties with jurisdiction initially over New Spain, Mexico, and Peru, and in the 18th century expanded with the viceroyalties of the Rio de la Plata, Argentina, Uruguay, and Bolivia, and New Granada, Colombia, Venezuela, Panama, Ecuador, and Guyana. The colony of Brazil was settled mainly in the coastal area by the Portuguese, and a large black slave population working on sugar plantations and mines. The boom and bust of the economic cycles were linked to export products. Brazil's sugar age, with the development of plantation slavery merchants serving as middlemen between production sites, Brazilian ports and Europe, was undermined by the growth of the sugar industry in the Caribbean on islands that European powers seized from Spain. Gold and diamonds were discovered and mined in southern Brazil through the end of the colonial era. Brazilian cities were largely port cities, and the colonial administrative capital was moved from Salvador to Rio de Janeiro in response to the rise and fall of export products' importance. Unlike Spanish America, which fragmented into many republics upon independence, Brazil remained a single administrative unit under a monarch as the Empire of Brazil, giving rise to the largest country in Latin America. Just as Spanish and Roman Catholicism were a core source of cohesion among Spain's vast and multi-ethnic territories, Brazilian society was united by the Portuguese language and Roman Catholicism. As the only Lusophone polity in the Americas, the Portuguese language was, and remains, particularly important to Brazilian identity. Decolonization. Decolonization of the Americas. The decolonization of the Americas occurred over several centuries, as most of the countries in the Americas gained their independence from European rule. The American Revolution was the first in the Americas, and the British defeat in the American Revolutionary War, 1775–83, was a victory against a great power, aided by France and Spain, Britain's enemies. The French Revolution in Europe followed, and collectively these events had profound effects on the Spanish, Portuguese, and French colonies in the Americas. A revolutionary wave followed, resulting in the creation of several independent countries in Latin America. The Haitian Revolution, 1791–1804, perhaps one of the most successful slave uprisings in history, resulted in the independence of the French slave colony of Saint-Domingue, now Haiti. The Peninsular War with France, which resulted from the Napoleonic occupation of Spain, caused Spanish Creoles in Spanish America to question their allegiance to Spain, stoking independence movements that culminated in various Spanish-American wars of independence, 1808–33, which were primarily fought between opposing groups of colonists and only secondarily against Spanish forces. At the same time, the Portuguese monarchy fled to Brazil during the French invasion of Portugal. After the royal court returned to Lisbon, the Prince Regent, Pedro, remained in Brazil and in 1822 successfully declared himself emperor of a newly independent Brazilian empire. Spain would lose all three of its remaining Caribbean colonies by the end of the 1800s. Santo Domingo declared its first independence from Spain in 1821. The independent state was renamed Republic of Spanish Haiti. Haiti conquered the region shortly afterwards in 1822. 2 decades later, in 1844, independence was proclaimed for the second time, and the Dominican Republic was established. This triggered the Dominican War of Independence, 1844–56. In 1861, however, Spain regained control of the territory, and the colony was re-established. The Dominican Restoration War, 1863–65, the Second War of Liberation, led to the second independence from Spain and the Dominican Republic's third and final independence. Cuba fought for independence from Spain in the 10 Years' War, 1868–78, and Little War, 1879–80, and finally the Cuban War of Independence, 1895–98. American intervention in 1898 became the Spanish-American War and resulted in the United States gaining Puerto Rico, Guam, which are still U.S. territories, and the Philippine Islands in the Pacific Ocean. Under military occupation, Cuba became a U.S. protectorate until its independence in 1902. Peaceful independence by the voluntary withdrawal of colonial powers then became the norm in the second half of the 20th century. However, there are still British and Dutch colonies in North America, mostly Caribbean islands. France has fully integrated most of its former colonies in the Americas, French Guiana, Guadeloupe, and Martinique, as fully constituent departments of France. The formation of sovereign states in the New World began with the United States Declaration of Independence of 1776. The American Revolutionary War lasted through the period of the Siege of Yorktown, its last major campaign, in the early autumn of 1781, with peace being achieved in 1783. In 1804, after the French of Napoleon Bonaparte were defeated during the Haitian Revolution under the black leadership of Jean-Jacques Dessalines, declare the colony of Saint-Domingue independence, of the Haitian Declaration of Independence, as he renamed the country Haiti, meaning Land of Mountains. Haiti became the world's first black-led republic in the New World, the first Caribbean state, as well as the first Latin American country and the second oldest independent nation in the Western Hemisphere after the United States, to win independence from Britain in 1783. The Spanish colonies won their independence in the first quarter of the 19th century, in the Spanish-American Wars of Independence. Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín, among others, led their independence struggle. Although Bolívar attempted to keep the Spanish-speaking parts of Latin America politically allied, they rapidly became independent of one another as well, and several further wars were fought, such as the Paraguayan War and the War of the Pacific. In the Portuguese colony, Dom Pedro I, also Pedro IV of Portugal, son of the Portuguese king Dom João VI, proclaimed the country's independence in 1822 and became Brazil's first emperor. This was peacefully accepted by the crown in Portugal upon compensation. Effects of slavery. Slavery has had a significant role in the economic development of the New World after the colonization of the Americas by the Europeans. The cotton, tobacco, and sugarcane harvested by slaves became important exports for the United States and the Caribbean countries. 20th century, North America, history of North America. The history of North America encompasses the past developments of people populating the continent of North America. While it was commonly accepted that the continent first became inhabited by humans when individuals migrated across the Bering Sea, 40,000 to 17,000 years ago, more recent discoveries may have pushed those estimates back at least another 90,000 years. People settled throughout the continent and, over time, developed into diverse communities, from the Inuit in the far north to the Mayans and Aztecs in the south. These complex communities each developed their own unique cultures and ways of life. Records of European travel to North America begin with the Norse colonization in the 10th century AD. In 985, they founded a settlement on Greenland that persisted until the early 1400s. They also explored the east coast of Canada, but their settlements there were much smaller and shorter-lived. With the age of exploration and the voyages of Christopher Columbus, starting in 1492, Europeans began to arrive in the Americas in large numbers and develop colonial ambitions for both North and South America. An influx of Europeans soon followed Columbus and overwhelmed native populations, as North America became a staging ground for ongoing European rivalries. The continent was divided by three prominent European powers: England, France, and Spain. The influence of colonization by these states on North American cultures is still apparent today. Conflict over resources in North America ensued in various wars between these powers, but the new European colonies gradually developed desires for independence. Revolutions, such as the American Revolution and the Mexican War of Independence, created new, independent states that came to dominate North America. The Canadian Confederation formed in 1867, marking the beginning of the modern political landscape of North America. North American states have, since the 19th century, developed increasingly deep connections with each other. Although some conflicts have occurred, the continent has enjoyed general peace and cooperation, as well as open commerce and trade between its states. Modern developments include the opening of free trade agreements in 1994 and heightened emigration rates and drug trafficking concerns in Mexico and Latin America. As a part of the British Empire, Canada immediately entered World War I when it broke out in 1914. Canada bore the brunt of several major battles during the early stages of the war, including the use of poison gas attacks at Ypres. Losses became grave, and the government eventually brought in conscription, despite the fact this was against the wishes of the majority of French Canadians. In the ensuing conscription crisis of 1917, riots broke out on the streets of Montreal. In neighboring Newfoundland, the new Dominion suffered a devastating loss on 1st July 1916, the first day on the Somme. The United States stayed out of the conflict until 1917, when it joined the Entente powers. The United States was then able to play a crucial role at the Paris Peace Conference of 1919 that shaped interwar Europe. Mexico was not part of the war, as the country was embroiled in the Mexican Revolution at the time. Further information: Roaring Twenties, Great Depression, and Cristero War. The 1920s brought an age of great prosperity in the United States, and to a lesser degree Canada. But the Wall Street crash of 1929, combined with drought, ushered in a period of economic hardship in the United States and Canada. From 1926 to 1929, there was a popular uprising against the anti-Catholic Mexican government of the time, set off specifically by the anti-clerical provisions of the Mexican Constitution of 1917. Once again, Canada found itself at war before its neighbors, with numerically modest but significant contributions overseas, such as the Battle of Hong Kong and the Battle of Britain. The entry of the United States into the war helped to tip the balance in favor of the Allies. Two Mexican tankers, transporting oil to the United States, were attacked and sunk by the Germans in the Gulf of Mexico waters in 1942. The incident happened in spite of Mexico's neutrality at that time. This led Mexico to enter the conflict with a declaration of war on the Axis nations. The destruction of Europe, wrought by the war, vaulted all North American countries to more important roles in world affairs, especially the United States, which emerged as a superpower. The early Cold War era saw the United States as the most powerful nation in a Western coalition, of which Mexico and Canada were also a part. In Canada, Quebec was transformed by the Quiet Revolution and the emergence of Quebec nationalism. Mexico experienced an era of huge economic growth after World War II, a heavy industrialization process and a growth of its middle class, a period known in Mexican history as El Milagro Mexicano, the Mexican miracle. The Caribbean saw the beginnings of decolonization, while on the largest island, the Cuban Revolution introduced Cold War rivalries into Latin America. The civil rights movement in the U.S. ended Jim Crow and empowered black voters in the 1960s, which allowed black citizens to move into high government offices for the first time since Reconstruction. However, the dominant New Deal coalition collapsed in the mid-1960s in disputes over race and the Vietnam War, and the conservative movement began its rise to power as the once dominant liberalism weakened and collapsed. Canada during this era was dominated by the leadership of Pierre Elliott Trudeau. In 1982, at the end of his tenure, Canada enshrined a new constitution. Canada's Brian Mulroney not only ran on a similar platform, but also favored closer trade ties with the United States. This led to the Canada-United States Free Trade Agreement in January 1989. Mexican presidents Miguel de la Madrid in the early 1980s and Carlos Salinas de Gortari in the late 1980s started implementing liberal economic strategies that were seen as a good move. However, Mexico experienced a strong economic recession in 1982, and the Mexican peso suffered a devaluation. In the United States, President Ronald Reagan attempted to move the United States back towards a hard anti-communist line in foreign affairs, in what his supporters saw as an attempt to assert moral leadership in the world community. Domestically, Reagan attempted to bring in a package of privatization and regulation to stimulate the economy. The end of the Cold War and the beginning of the era of sustained economic expansion coincided during the 1990s. On January 1994, Canada, Mexico, and the United States signed the North American Free Trade Agreement, creating the world's largest free trade area. In 2000, Vicente Fox became the first non-PRI candidate to win the Mexican presidency in over 70 years. The optimism of the 1990s was shattered by the 9/11 attacks of 2001 on the United States, which prompted military intervention in Afghanistan, which also involved Canada. Canada did not support the United States' later move to invade Iraq, however. In the US, the Reagan era of conservative national policies, deregulation, and tax cuts took control with the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. By 2010, political scientists were debating whether the election of Barack Obama in 2008 represented an end of the Reagan era, or was only a reaction against the bubble economy of the 2000s decade, which burst in 2008 and became the late 2000s recession with prolonged unemployment. Central America. History of Central America. 20th century political map of Central America. Central America is commonly said to include Guatemala, Belize, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama. This definition matches modern political borders. Central America begins geographically in Mexico, at the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, Mexico's narrowest point. In the former country of Yucatan, 1841-1848, was part of Central America. At the other end, before its independence in 1903, Panama was part of South America, as it was a department of Colombia. At times, Belize, a British colony until 1981, where English instead of Spanish is spoken, and where the population is primarily of African origin, has been considered not part of Spanish-speaking Central America. Political evolution of Central America and the Caribbean from 1700 to present. Long and narrow, Central America does not have an obvious geographical center. Until the middle of the 20th century, there were no roads between the countries, which isolated them from each other, and railroads have never connected them. During colonial times, Guatemala was the administrative and religious center. Religiously, it remains so. However, attempts to create a Central American political union, like the European Union, have failed. The countries that joined the EU already had extensive cross-border traffic by train. Even today, 2021, there is by comparison very little and none by train. The countries, furthermore, are more diverse than they appear at first glance. Some, Guatemala, have a large indigenous or Native American population. Others, Costa Rica, do not. Some, El Salvador, are focused on their Pacific coast, while in others, Belize, Honduras, the Caribbean or Atlantic coast is more important. Panama, and to a lesser extent, Guatemala and Costa Rica have both coasts playing a significant role. Some countries have stable governments, Costa Rica, others do not. Nicaragua, El Salvador. Panama is heavily Americanized, uses the US dollar as its currency, has a large industry and source of revenue, the canal, and a sophistication which comes from the ships and people passing through the country, and previously the US military installations in the former canal zone. Central America. Central America is a sub-region of North America. Its political boundaries are defined as bordering Mexico to the north, Colombia to the southeast, the Caribbean to the east, and the Pacific Ocean to the southwest. Central America is usually defined as consisting of 7 countries: Belize, Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Panama. Within Central America is the Mesoamerican biodiversity hotspot, which extends from southern Mexico to southeastern Panama. Due to the presence of several active geologic faults and the Central American volcanic arc, there is a high amount of seismic activity in the region, such as volcanic eruptions and earthquakes, which has resulted in death, injury, and property damage. Most of Central America falls under the Isthmo-Colombian cultural area. Before the Spanish expedition of Christopher Columbus's voyages to the Americas, hundreds of indigenous peoples made their homes in the area. From the year 1502 onwards, Spain began their colonization. From 1609 to 1821, the majority of Central American territories, except for what would become Belize and Panama, and including the modern Mexican state of Chiapas, were governed by the Viceroyalty of New Spain from Mexico City as the Captaincy General of Guatemala. On 24 August 1821, Spanish Viceroy Juan de O'Donoghue signed the Treaty of Córdoba, which established New Spain's independence and autonomy from mainland Spain. On 15th September, the Act of Independence of Central America was enacted to announce Central America is separation from the Spanish Empire. Some of New Spain's provinces in the Central American region were invaded and annexed to the First Mexican Empire. However, in 1823 they seceded from Mexico to form the Federal Republic of Central America until 1838. In 1838, Costa Rica, Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua became the first of Central America's 7 states to become independent countries, followed by El Salvador in 1841, Panama in 1903, and Belize in 1981. Despite the dissolution of the Federal Republic of Central America, the 5 remaining countries, save for Panama and Belize, all preserved and maintained a Central American identity. The Spanish-speaking countries officially include both North America and South America as a single continent. America, which is split into 4 subregions: Central America, Insular America, aka the West Indies, North America, Mexico, and Northern America, and South America. Despite the failure of a lasting political union, the concept of Central American reunification, though lacking enthusiasm from the leaders of the individual countries, rises from time to time. In 1856, 1857, the region successfully established a military coalition to repel an invasion by United States adventurer William Walker. Today, all 5 nations fly flags that retain the old federal motif of 2 outer blue bands bounding an inner white stripe. Costa Rica, traditionally the least committed of the 5 to regional integration, modified its flag significantly in 1848 by darkening the blue and adding a double-wide inner red band in honor of the French tricolor. In 1907, a Central American Court of Justice was created. On 13th December 1960, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, and Nicaragua established the Central American Common Market, CACMA. Costa Rica, because of its relative economic prosperity and political stability, chose not to participate in the CACM. The goals for the CACM were to create greater political unification and success of import substitution industrialization policies. The project was an immediate economic success, but was abandoned after the 1969 football war between El Salvador and Honduras. A Central American Parliament has operated as a purely advisory body since 1991. Costa Rica has repeatedly declined invitations to join the regional parliament, which seats deputies from the 4 other former members of the Union, as well as from Panama and the Dominican Republic. South America. History of South America. The history of South America is the study of the past, particularly the written record, oral histories, and traditions passed down from generation to generation on the continent of South America. The continent continues to be home to indigenous peoples, some of whom built high civilizations prior to the arrival of Europeans in the late 1400s and early 1500s. South America has a history that has a wide range of human cultures and forms of civilization. The Norte Chico civilization in Peru, dating back to about 3500 BCE, is the oldest civilization in the Americas, and one of the first 6 independent civilizations in the world. It was contemporaneous with the Egyptian pyramids. It predated the Mesoamerican Olmec by nearly 2 millennia. Indigenous peoples, thousands of years of independent life, were disrupted by European colonization from Spain and Portugal, and by demographic collapse. The resulting civilizations, however, were very different from those of their colonizers, both in the mestizos and the indigenous cultures of the continent. Through the transatlantic slave trade, South America, especially Brazil, became the home of millions of people of the African diaspora. The mixing of ethnic groups led to new social structures. The tensions between Europeans indigenous peoples, and African slaves and their descendants shaped South America as a whole, starting in the 16th century. Most of Spanish America achieved its independence in the early 19th century through hard-fought wars, while Portuguese Brazil first became the seat of the Portuguese Empire and then an empire independent of Portugal. With the revolution for independence from the Spanish crown achieved during the 19th century, South America underwent yet more social and political changes. These have included nation-building projects, absorbing waves of immigration from Europe in the late 19th and 20th centuries, dealing with increased international trade, colonization of hinterlands, and wars about territory ownership and power balance. During this period, there has also been the reorganization of indigenous rights and duties, subjugation of indigenous peoples living in the state's frontiers that lasted until the early 1900s, liberal conservative conflicts among the ruling classes, and major demographic and environmental changes accompanying the development of sensitive habitats. In the 1960s and 1970s, the governments of Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and Uruguay were overthrown or displaced by the UFAS-aligned military dictatorships. These dictatorships detained tens of thousands of political prisoners, many of whom were tortured and/or killed. Economically, they began a transition to neoliberal economic policies. They placed their own actions within the United States Cold War doctrine of national security against internal subversion. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, Peru suffered from an internal conflict. Revolutionary movements and right-wing military dictatorships have been common. But starting in the 1980s, a wave of democratization came through the continent, and democratic rule is widespread now. Allegations of corruption remain common, and several nations have seen crises which have forced the resignation of their presidents, although normal civilian succession has continued. International indebtedness became a notable problem, as most recently illustrated by Argentina's default in the early 21st century. In recent years, South American governments have drifted to the left, with socialist leaders being elected in Chile, Bolivia, Brazil, Venezuela, and a leftist president in Argentina and Uruguay. Despite the move to the left, South America is still largely capitalist. With the founding of the Union of South American Nations, South America has started down the road of economic integration, with plans for political integration in the European Union style. Caribbean.